In this lesson, we are going to add in a few extra oscillator waveforms. Currently, we have saw and triangle wave oscillators. Now we'll be creating square, sine, and PWM square waves, plus a new saw wave we'll call the morphing saw oscillator. Let's start with a square wave. Take a look in BP Select 1, 4, Source, Oscillator C, and scroll down to Basic Square. This wave is very simple. We will be either max amp positive or negative. We have our usual checks at the beginning to keep the phase in between 0 and 2 times pi. Then, if phase is less than pi, out will equal amp. Otherwise, out will equal negative amp. So if amp was 0.5, this would be a positive 0.5, and this would be a negative 0.5. We have our usual phase incrementer at the bottom with our return value of out. It really doesn't get any simpler than this waveform. Now there is one problem with this waveform. It is the noisiest one when it comes to additional harmonics. The higher frequencies will have background noise that sounds like an old AM radio called harmonics. When it comes to naive waveforms, such as this one, square waves are the worst. Saw waves come in second, and the least noisy are the triangle and sine waves. The waves with sudden transitions from a positive peak to a negative peak create the loudest harmonics. Square does it twice, and saw does it once for each cycle. Triangle and sine waves have more gradual transitions, so the harmonics are not as noticeable for them. Now let's scroll down to the next oscillator, which is the sine oscillator. Here we have something a little different. First we create a local variable, z. We do the usual checks on the phase to keep it between 0 and 2 pi. Next we perform a sine function to phase and save the result to z. Then we multiply amp times z and save it to out. We do the usual phase incrementer and we return the value of out. Sine f is a function that is included in the math.h header file we included in our oscillators h file. Math.h is a standard library for C. You can find more information by searching for Math C library. We won't be going into the complexities of the sine math function, but if you want to check the math sine f is performing, you can use a calculator that has a sine button on it. Make sure you are in radian mode and not in degrees or grad mode. There is usually another button on the calculator to change the mode. If you end up with values very different from the examples we do, you are probably not in radian mode. Some calculators expect you to put the argument in first, then press sine. Others demand you press sine first, then enter the argument. The point of using radian mode is we will soon see it has a relationship with pi. Let's do a quick example with the Windows calculator. Change to scientific mode, select radian, enter 0.1, click the trigonometry tab, and then press sine. You should end up with a value like this, 0.099833466, and so on. And here's a listing of results of several more calculations. For the last one, look for a pi symbol on the calculator. Divide by 2, then press the sine button. You should get an even 1 result. This would be a peak positive value in the sine oscillator. Now let's go past half a pi and we see examples like this. Interestingly, we are now going back down in values, and if we keep going, we end up in negative values like these examples. When phase equals 2 pi, we will be at 0 again. So we can clearly see that radian sine and pi have a relationship here. The sine f function is converting the phase values from 0 to 2 pi into values that range from 0 to 1, back to 0, to -1, then back to 0 again. This creates a sine wave. Now all you have to do is use the amp parameter to control how loud the sine wave is using a combination of direct volume control and the automated envelope generator control, which we do with op out equals op amp times z. Unfortunately, the math used to create a sine wave can be complex for the microcontroller to perform. We can use the sine wave in LFOs and as an audio oscillator, but do realize if the microcontroller is trying to do several math-intensive functions while doing the sine operations, it could begin to make pops, clicks, or other unwanted conditions. As I said in the beginning of the lessons, this is an educational synthesizer, not a professional one. It's going to have limitations. A workaround if you are having issues with the sine wave is to reduce extra methods you are using, such as envelope generators and effects. You may also have problems using it as a LFO. Try using the triangle wave instead of sine wave if it gives you any trouble. Sine wave is not a very loud timbre. At low frequencies, you can barely hear it, but with some good subwoofers, you can definitely feel it. When played at higher frequencies, it can sound like a bell or a whistle. We will add in 2 more oscillators here in a bit, but first let's go over how we will select them with a MIDI control change to select the different waveforms. The graphic user interface has a knob we can use to select the few waveforms we have at the moment. We won't be using the drop-down menu in the GUI right now because it will not be accurate until we get closer to the final lesson with all the timbre names added to the code. Let's give the GUI knob a try. I have the Select1 project already flashed into the BP synth. I will play a note and turn the knob so we can hear them all. To see how we select our new oscillators and how they are calculated into our samples, let's go take a look in Oscillators H. In here we have an enum defined called timbre. The timbre enum has a few names of different timbres inside of it. Again, we start with the first one equals 0, and each additional name is incremented by 1 in the order listed. I gave this enum the name timbre because later on we won't be calling just one oscillator function. We may call 2 or more oscillators at the same time or do some other functions along with an oscillator. So please don't confuse oscillator names with timbre names, even though they may both have similar names. Please take notice that we have an enumerator at the end called last sound. It will always be at the end when we add in more timbre names later. When we add in more timbre names, the value of last sound will increment automatically. Currently, it is 4. If we were to add in 2 more names, it would equal 6. Now let's take a quick look in MIDI CCs, and we find a new case, number 6, Select val. So when the BP synth receives a control change number 6, it will call the Select, which is located in parameter function C, right here. Earlier, when we moved the knob in the GUI to select different waveforms, it was actually sending control change number 6 data values. So you could easily set up a MIDI keyboard controller to do the same thing using a control change number 6 assigned knob. Now let's take a closer look at Select. You will notice we are using another new function, RINTF. This is short for round integer float value. Round integer is also a math.h library function that is used to round out any float value to the nearest integer. Notice the enumerator last sound is in here as well. Right now, last sound equals 4. So the osselect function will run like so if val equals 85. A range of values from 1.5 to 2.4 would round out to a value of 2. 2.007 falls into this range. Thus, our final result is osselect equals 2. Essentially what we are doing here is converting the MIDI control change data value into 4 values of 0 to 3 that is more or less evenly spaced apart so we can use the full range of a knob to select all the different timbres. The knobs on my Axiom controller are endless rotary encoder knobs. But if they were standard potentiometers, there would be top and bottom endpoints. And the sound selections would change evenly across the entire range of the knob. The data conversions we have going on in the osselect function will become more clear when we add in more timbre names. Here in a bit we will see how last sound is used to add in more names to the timbre enum list without changing anything in the osselect function. So now we have a value for osselect, which is 2. If we take a peek inside of wavegen.c and scroll down to the make sound for loop, you will find y equals wavecompute osselect f1. You can see we have changed the wavecompute function to include a new argument, osselect. The values we will be passing are osselect for our timbre value and f1 for the frequency value. Now let's head over to Oscillator C again and scroll down to wavecompute. We can see we added in the 8-bit argument select. Select is where the value of osselect will be passed to. Inside the function we see a new switch case. It refers to select in its evaluations. You will also see several cases listed with the previously mentioned enumerators next to them: basic saw, basic square, basic triangle, basic sine. The function has the enumerators listed in the same order as listed in the timbre enum listing. But I wanted to make it clear that it does not matter the order they are listed in the switch select function, since each enumerator has a numerical value attached to the names. The case switch functions are evaluating numerical values, not the actual names. In other words, just the values the names represent. In this example, osselect equals 2, which is basic triangle. So when the switch evals for a match, it will end up at case basic triangle, y equals basic triangle, address of op1, break. So our sample will be processed in the basic triangle function, and the parameters will be saved in the oscillator t struct op1. Now I want to add a couple more timbres to our selections. Let's go over to BP osselect 2 or include oscillators H. Notice we've added 2 more timbre names to the timbre enum: MorphSaw and Pulse. Notice how MorphSaw and Pulse were added after basic sine, but before last sound. In the revised enum, we've increased the range of values from 0 to 4 to 0 to 6. Previously, last sound had a value of 4. Now it has a value of 6. Now let's try the Select function again with the val equals 85 argument. Here you can see that last sound has automatically been changed from 4 to 6 because we slipped in 2 more names in the timbre note. So now when we use the same value of 85 in the function, we end up with a final value of 3 instead of 2 as it was when last sound equaled 4. We can keep adding in more names, and each time we add another, last sound's value will increase and alter the way Select function will convert the MIDI control change data. Now we can use the same knob to change between 6 sounds instead of 4, and they are evenly distributed from end to end on the knob's travel. Now let's go take a look at the 2 new timbres we are adding in. Go to Oscillator C and scroll down to Morphing Saw. We won't be going through a detailed run of the math here due to its complex interaction between frequency and phase. We'd be here for a very long time checking into all the different scenarios that could happen. It's not that the math is difficult to explain, we just don't have all day to explain it fully. Instead, I will simply explain that instead of producing a noisy, naive sawtooth waveform, what this oscillator will do is start tilting back the sawtooth shape when we go up higher in frequency. Higher frequencies will look more like a triangle wave than a sawtooth. We do this to keep down the harmonics, and it works very well without bogging down the microcontroller with heavy math functions. Now we are going to build a special oscillator. It's called a pulse wave oscillator because it is a square wave that we can manipulate the duty cycle either manually or by using a low frequency oscillator. The duty cycle is also known as the pulse width, and when we modulate it using an LFO, we call it pulse width modulation. So this oscillator will have pulse width modulation. Before we get into the pulse wave, we need to take a look into what is used to control the pulse width or pulse width modulation. Let's take a peek in MIDI-CCs.c and scroll down to these 3 right here: PWM amp set, PWM frequency set, and square wave duty cycle. The first 2 control changes will be used to control our pulse width modulation depth and pulse width modulation frequency. The last one will be used to control the pulse width manually. Let's look into the parameter functions.c file and scroll down to square duty cycle, PWM set, PWM frequency set. The square duty cycle function remaps the control change value from 0 to 127 to 0.15 to 6 and assigns it to PWM. PWM amp set remaps 0 to 127 to 0 to 1 and assigns it to PWM LFO amp. PWM frequency set remaps 0 to 127 to 0 to 2.5 and assigns it to PWM LFO frequency. Now that we see what values we can work with, let's take a look at the pulse wave oscillator. We have 2 different ways the pulse width is modified. The first is manual mode. If our control change value gets remapped to a value that is greater than 0.16, we are in manual mode, and the duty cycle will change when we move our pulse width modulation control by hand. If we turn our pulse width modulation control down to 0, the PWM LFO oscillator will take over, changing the pulse width duty cycle automatically. While this may not be a traditional method to select pulse width modulation on or off, It is a quick and dirty way to do it with less control knobs. Once you understand how it all works, you can easily change the control methods to your liking. For example, if you'd rather the pulse width modulation activate at the top end of the control, all you'd have to change is float PWM equals 0 to PWM 6 at the top here, so it defaults to pulse width modulation at startup, and change PWM greater than 0.16 to PWM less than 5.98. Now let's take a look back at the top here of oscillators.c, and you'll see we have a new oscillator called PWM LFO. Going back to our oscillator, when we go into automatic mode, we call the LFO oscillator in our else if statement. If op phase is less than map float, basic sine, address of PWM LFO, -1 to 1, 0.15 to 6, op out equals op amp. Every time we check this if statement, basic sine at PWM LFO will be ran, and all the parameters for it will get updated, and the PWM LFO.out value will be returned to be used in the map float function. The return value from the LFO will range from -1 to +1, but this value will get remapped to a range of 0.15 to 6. We then check the remap value against our phase value, which will be a range of 0 to 2 pi, which is 0 to 6.28. If our remap LFO value is less than phase, the out value will equal amp. Otherwise, op out will equal negative amp. The basic sine LFO has a smoother transition flow than a triangle LFO does, making the phasing effect hold at the peaks a little longer. It's very important to keep our remapped LFO values range in between 0.15 and 6 because we don't want to have our square wave stay at positive amp or negative amp constantly. We want it to change from positive or negative at the beginning or end of the waveform just for a tiny amount of time before our waveform cycle restarts. Otherwise, we will not get any sound. It will just be a flat positive or negative DC signal. Remember, we can only hear vibrations, which are AC signals. The effect we get from pulse width modulation is something like a flanger or phaser, making a simple, dull square wave into a much more interesting and lively waveform. We will be using pulse width modulation methods on other waveforms in later lessons, including adding influences from the envelope generators. In our next lesson, we will be adding in a virtual analog filter.